LUKOIL, Russia's largest private oil company, has announced it's selling all of its overseas investments. Every refinery, oil field, and petrol station outside of Russia is being put up for sale. It's not a strategic adjustment, it's a sanction driven fire sale. In this video, I'll show you exactly what LUKOIL is selling, why it's being forced to do so, and why this is terrible news not just for the company, but for the entire Russian economy. Hi, welcome back. If you've been following the channel, you'll be aware that Donald Trump recently applied direct sanctions on Russia's two largest oil companies, Rosneft, which is state-owned, and LUKOIL, which is the largest private oil company in Russia. And as you've just heard, LUKOIL has now announced, as a direct result of those sanctions, that it is now looking to sell all of its overseas investments, and these are significant. Now, firstly, let's just talk about LUKOIL itself. This is one of the world's largest private oil companies, founded in 1991 and located, well, its headquarters is in Moscow, but it's located all around the world. It employs over 100,000 people. That is a significant size in terms of the amount of people that are being paid directly by LUKOIL in more than 30 countries. And it produces around 2.2 million barrels of oil per day. So that's around 2% of total global output. So LUKOIL is a serious player. When you think about 2%, there's basically only 50 companies that could fill that percentage. So that really puts into context how big LUKOIL is. It's holding around 14.7 billion barrels of proven reserves in all of the sites that it owns, which is amongst the biggest in the world in terms of private ownership. And in terms of refining, it has capacity of around 1.1 million barrels per day that it can produce. So again, a serious amount of gasoline and diesel coming out from LUKOIL. And in addition to the upstream side of things, it also operates 5,300 fuel stations around the world under the LUKOIL brand. It generates around $30 billion worth of revenue and has a market cap of just under 50 billion. So we are talking a huge business here. The sanctions that have been applied by the USA are really hurting LUKOIL because up until this point, it was sanction free, which is it's a questionable decision as to why the West hadn't applied sanctions on LUKOIL and Rosneft. But as I said in a previous video, one of the reasons why they didn't is because everybody was worried about upsetting the global supply and demand of oil, because between them, those two companies account for around about 5% of all of the oil that's being exported, so that's in the global market. So if you'd have taken them out overnight at the start of the war in Ukraine, we might have seen oil prices going up as high as $200 per barrel. That was what a lot of people were predicting at that point. So the sanctions were held back against these two companies to make sure that the globe didn't go into a deep recession. However, now that we're coming up towards 4 years of war, the USA's lost patience, and particularly Donald Trump, because he's been trying to get Vladimir Putin around the table and agree some sort of ceasefire. He's definitely lost patience with those discussions, and so that's why he's pulled out the big guns and hit LUKOIL and Rosneft with these sanctions. Now, as a result of the sanctions, LUKOIL is now finding that nobody wants to deal with it. So that's a major problem when you've got assets overseas, because if you've got refineries and oil fields and things like that in other countries, they are now dead in the water. They can't operate. So the company has announced that it's disposing of all of its assets, but it isn't going to be quite as simple as that, because in countries like Bulgaria and Kazakhstan, LUKOIL owns huge refineries that actually contribute a major proportion of all of the fuel in those countries. So the governments in Bulgaria and Kazakhstan have already stepped in and said that they're going to be involved in this process, which means that LUKOIL won't be able to sell out to the highest bidder. They'll basically be put through a forced process. And Russia has issued a wind down license to the company. However, LUKOIL might not have as much time as it would like to get the best possible price. And in fact, it's probably going to have to dispose of these assets in a fire sale, which means that it's going to just have to take any offers that it gets. So the value of the assets is going to be significantly written down from LUKOIL's point of view. Now, in terms of why LUKOIL is doing this, well, obviously, the pressure of the sanctions are now taking a toll on the company because its international trade has been taken out. Nobody can deal with LUKOIL anymore. So there's no point in having all of these overseas operations because they've basically been taken out of the global market. There is also a major risk of asset seizure here. If you've been following the channel, you'll know that Russia, over the last 3 years, has seized multiple different businesses because it says that it's in the interests of the state, it's in for national security reasons. And likewise, other countries may now decide, so Bulgaria and Kazakhstan are good examples, they might decide that they need those assets to keep operating. And if they can't operate under LUKOIL ownership, which they can't at the moment because anybody that deals with LUKOIL would be sanctioned under the secondary sanctions, then they might decide to nationalise those assets in their country, take them away from LUKOIL and start running them by the state, because that would then free up all of the trade. You'd be able to deal with the refinery in Bulgaria and Kazakhstan, for example, if they're not owned by LUKOIL. So LUKOIL is facing a very real potential of losing all of its assets for zero value. There's also the issue of operational isolation. So if LUKOIL is relying upon Western companies to keep providing it with various services, then those are going to stop immediately. And that's a problem if you've got a refinery. If it comes to a grinding halt, it won't be quite as easy as just leaving it for a few months and then switching it back on and everything carries on as normal. These are huge industrial processes. And if you shut them down, it could have major operational consequences in the future. And the other thing that LUKOIL is also having to do is get authorization to sell these assets because they're critical for the infrastructure in many countries. The governments are having to approve who's actually buying it. They don't want it falling into the hands of somebody else who may be hit with sanctions or maybe already has sanctions. So there's a number of different issues that LUKOIL is now facing. Now, in terms of what assets LUKOIL actually owns, this is a good opportunity to talk about the difference between upstream and downstreams, which are terms that are used commonly in the oil industry. But if you're not in the oil industry, you probably don't know what upstream and downstream means. Upstream is basically where you're getting all of the oil from, so it's basically reserves and those sorts of things. And downstream is when you're actually processing it, so it's refineries, oil stations, gas stations, those sorts of things. So if we have a quick look at the upstream assets, so these are probably the most valuable because these are the reserves of oil. It's got an oil field in Iraq where it owns a 75% interest, and that oil field is producing 400,000 barrels of crude oil per day, so that's a raw asset that's got significant value. It also owns a 60% interest in what's called Block 10 in Iraq, which is a large undeveloped field which is estimated to contain over 1 billion barrels of crude oil, so again, significant value. In Uzbekistan, it's got 2 long-term production sharing agreements on gas fields that are producing around 120,000 barrels of oil per day equivalent, and the other is producing 55,000 barrels a day per equivalent. So again, significant assets. In Egypt, it owns oil and gas fields in the Western Desert with a total output of around 25,000 barrels per day. And it's also got some assets in Cameroon and West Africa. So they're the upstream assets. In terms of the downstream, in Bulgaria, and I talked about this in a recent video, it has a refinery that's producing around 190,000 barrels per day of refined products. That's actually one of the biggest in Bulgaria, and Bulgaria is dependent on that refinery. So what happens with that one is going to be critical from Bulgaria's point of view. In Romania, it owns a refinery producing around 48,000 barrels per day and has a network of 320 retail gas stations. In the Netherlands, it owns a 45% stake in a refinery producing 220,000 barrels per day. It also owns a network of gas stations in the Netherlands and Belgium through previous acquisitions. And in Serbia and the Balkans, it owns around 120 petrol stations and a major oil storage facility in North Macedonia. Now, in terms of what these facilities are worth, it's very difficult to actually put a figure on it because LUKOIL doesn't announce the value of all of its different assets. But there is some historical data which gives us an indication as to what it paid for some of these assets. And I've pulled up the list here. I won't go through it because there's a lot of detail here, but just picking out the big ones. You can see that in Uzbekistan, there was a multi-year investment back in 2004. It started off at 3.1 billion. By 2021, that had increased to 8 billion. And there were plans to increase that further to $12 billion. So we are talking a significant amount of investment into these overseas facilities. Equally, another project in Uzbekistan had a value of 1.2 billion, and that was actually going to increase to 4.3 billion. And then we've got lots of other facilities here that the company has paid hundreds of millions of dollars for. And a lot of these are quite old, so they're dating back to the late 90s, early 2000s. So in today's context, if you are valuing these assets, it would be in tens of billions of dollars because these are highly valuable. You don't find lots of oil fields and refineries. They are quite rare in terms of some of these countries. They are very dependent on these facilities. So if LUKOIL was selling these assets in a normal environment, it would probably be looking to get $100 billion, something like that, because this is quite an impressive collection of overseas assets generating lots of profit. But obviously, LUKOIL isn't in that position. It's not able to negotiate the best price. And as I've just mentioned, it actually is at risk of some of these assets being taken off them. They may be nationalised by countries like Bulgaria. So as I mentioned at the start of today's video, all of this is really bad news for LUKOIL for multiple reasons. Firstly, it's not in control of this sale process. It can't sell to the highest bidder for the best possible price. That is not going to happen. It will be lucky if it gets paid for any of these assets because at the moment, they're non-operational. They can't actually do anything because of the sanctions that have been put in place. In addition to that, LUKOIL has now lost all of that foreign currency income. And if you follow the channel, you'll know that lots of businesses in Russia have been looking to avoid using rubles because of the deterioration in the value of the ruble and the fact that internationally, not many companies want to be paid in rubles. In fact, very few. So having all of that foreign income was really valuable to LUKOIL. Firstly, because it doesn't deteriorate as quickly as the ruble. And secondly, you can use that foreign currency to buy things. You can use it for trading. So it's going to lose all of that business. In addition to that, it's going to lose its relationships with overseas financial institutions. So it may have been taking some lending and having local dealings with various banks. All of those are over now because of the sanctions in place. And this is basically shrinking the company's global footprint. The reason why it's been buying all of these overseas assets is because it wanted to diversify away from just having exposure to Russia. It wanted to have access to the global markets and benefit from other areas. Now it's going backwards. It's shrinking back to only looking at the Russian market. And if you've been following the channel, you'll know that the Russian economy is in real difficulty at the moment. So that's really bad news for LUKOIL because they will only be able to benefit from selling oil to Russians. But in addition to being bad news for LUKOIL, it is also bad news for Russia and the Russian economy because that loss of foreign income, the loss of dollar trading and euro trading will affect the Russian government because they want foreign currency. It's useful to Russia to be able to buy things. LUKOIL will also reduce in size, which means its revenue and its profits and the amount of tax that it's paying will reduce. So therefore, it won't contribute as much in terms of GDP. But there's also a loss of influence and control because LUKOIL, as one of the biggest Russian oil companies, does have significant influence in countries like Bulgaria and Uzbekistan. And now that influence is going to disappear. So Russia, by default, won't have as much influence over those countries. It won't be as important to them. And so from a political point of view, it could also see a reduction. So this is going to hurt Russia both economically and politically. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because over the past month or so, we've been looking at specific details as to what the sanctions are doing in terms of impacting Russian companies. And I think the sanctions that have been applied against LUKOIL and Rosneft are probably having the biggest impact out of any sanctions that we've seen being applied in the last 6 or 12 months. Because the two biggest oil companies in Russia are now unable to trade worldwide. Nobody wants to deal with them because if you do, you run the risk of being hit by secondary sanctions. And we've seen the impact of that recently in India. India was told to stop buying Russian oil. It didn't do so. And as a result of that, Donald Trump imposed a 50% tariff on all Indian imports into the USA, which is its biggest export market. So Indian companies are now suffering and worried about the future. So India is having to rethink about how it goes about dealing with Russia and it's pulled back on purchasing Russian oil. That's obviously hurting Russia. And these secondary sanctions are very real. So even China is now saying that it's going to pull back from buying Russian oil. The four big state companies that have been dealing with Russia for the past 3.5 years have cancelled their orders. So this is causing major problems for Russia, and LUKOIL particularly is now suffering. As we've talked about in today's video, LUKOIL has now announced that it's having to sell all of its international assets. Now, this is a major step backwards for a company that wanted to become a big global player. Over the last 30 years, LUKOIL has expanded. It started buying businesses and refineries and oil fields overseas because it wanted to have more of a base rather than just being focused on the Russian market. But unfortunately, as a direct result of these sanctions, it's unable to continue trading with all of those entities, and so it's now having to sell them. Now, that's a problem in terms of logistically, you're going to have to go through multiple sale processes. So if you were a multinational company and you decided to sell all of your overseas businesses overnight, then clearly that's a big job. Ideally, you'd like to sell them to a single buyer because it would be much easier to do so. You could just agree one deal, sign a contract, and sell it for hundreds of billions of dollars. Job done. Everybody's a winner. But unfortunately, from LUKOIL's point of view, it's not going down that road because it's being forced to sell these assets. These assets have now come to a grinding halt. They can't do any trade. Nobody wants to deal with them. And so they're having to dump them. And unfortunately, from LUKOIL's point of view, even if there were lots of buyers that wanted to come along and pay a good price, they won't be able to just complete a simple sale process because the governments in all of those overseas countries are now getting involved because they don't want to see these assets falling into the wrong hands, and equally they don't want to see them out of commission for a long period of time because in places like Bulgaria and Uzbekistan and Romania, they're dependent on that oil flow. Their market will be thrown into turmoil if all of the flows stop overnight. So there is a very real chance that those assets might be nationalised. The news of this fire sale will be heard loud and clear in all of those different economies, and people will be saying, okay, we need to seize these assets, take control, get LUKOIL off the books so that we can then start trading with other companies, paying people, receiving payments, and carrying on as normal. So there's a very real chance that LUKOIL won't get much, if anything, for these assets. And that's obviously bad news for the company because they're going to lose the revenue and the income flows and the overseas currency that they were getting. So LUKOIL is now going to be a much smaller business. Its sole market is going to be Russia. And as we've talked about, Russia is currently going through a lot of economic problems. So that's not ideal if you're sitting on the board of LUKOIL. But it's also not ideal if you're sitting in the Kremlin, because LUKOIL, as one of the biggest companies in Russia, is paying a huge amount of tax. So its tax will go down as its profit and revenue fall, so that's bad news. But also the influence that Russia had over various countries as a result of LUKOIL being the biggest player in their markets will also be taken away. So it's a double whammy from Russia's point of view. So the new sanctions that have been put in place are really starting to bite. They've hurt one of the biggest oil companies in Russia, and that will hurt the Russian economy. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking, which is what I'm really trying to do, get you thinking of things in a different way, looking at news stories and thinking about what the implications of that are, not just the story itself. So hopefully I'm achieving that goal. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and thank you so much to everyone supporting me. If you're a Patreon or a YouTube member, thank you. You're in my club. I really appreciate it. It really means a lot to me. And if you've bought me a super thanks or a coffee or signed up as a Buy Me a Coffee member, thank you for that support. Really appreciate it. And here's something to put a smile on your face.